The lock clicked before I reached the front door. I stared at it, confused because my own key no longer fit. Then my phone buzzed with a single message that changed everything I believed about family. Don't come back. You don't live here anymore. I read those words 3 times, waiting for someone to tell me it was a mistake. No one did. The curtains moved for just a second, as if someone inside had been watching me all along. I smiled, picked up my suitcase, and quietly walked away. They thought they had taken my home. They had no idea they had just handed me the one thing that would expose every lie they had spent years hiding. I never imagined that the hardest lesson of my 70 years would come from the people whose photographs filled every shelf in my living room. For most of my life, I believed kindness could outlast pride, patience could outlast anger, and family could survive almost anything. I was wrong. Looking back now, I can see that losing my house wasn't the real tragedy. The real tragedy was realizing I had ignored dozens of warning signs because I wanted to believe love was stronger than selfishness. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 70 years old, a retired elementary school librarian from Columbus, Ohio. I spent 38 years helping children discover stories that taught honesty, compassion, and courage. I honestly believed those same values had taken root inside my own family. My husband, Richard, and I built our 2-story brick home almost 40 years ago. Every room carried memories that could never be replaced. We painted the nursery ourselves before our son Daniel was born. We planted 2 maple trees in the front yard the spring after our 10th anniversary. We celebrated birthdays, graduations, Thanksgiving dinners, and quiet Sunday afternoons around the same oak dining table Richard insisted would last forever. After Richard passed away from heart failure 3 years ago, the house became both my comfort and my burden. Every hallway reminded me of the man who used to whistle while fixing loose cabinet doors or trimming the hedges before the neighbors woke up. Living there alone was difficult, but leaving never crossed my mind. It wasn't simply a house. It was the last place where I could still hear echoes of the life we had built together. Daniel visited less often after he married Lauren. First, I blamed busy schedules. Careers were demanding. Traffic across town was frustrating. Young couples needed privacy. Every excuse sounded reasonable because I wanted it to. Lauren always smiled politely when she saw me, but there was something careful about her kindness. It felt measured, as though every compliment had been rehearsed before it reached her lips. She insisted on organizing family dinners, handling financial conversations, even answering questions that were directed at Daniel. I noticed it, but I convinced myself that every family changes after marriage. Love requires adjustment, I reminded myself. I had repeated those words so many times that I almost believed them. I never imagined those quiet adjustments were slowly becoming the foundation of the day I would stand on my own front porch, holding a useless key, wondering how a stranger could be locked out of the home she had spent a lifetime creating. The lock clicked before I reached the front door. I stared at it, confused because my own key no longer fit. Then my phone buzzed with a single message that changed everything I believed about family. Don't come back. You don't live here anymore. I read those words 3 times, waiting for someone to tell me it was a mistake. No one did. The curtains moved for just a second, as if someone inside had been watching me all along. I smiled, picked up my suitcase, and quietly walked away. They thought they had taken my home. They had no idea they had just handed me the one thing that would expose every lie they had spent years hiding. I never imagined that the hardest lesson of my 70 years would come from the people whose photographs filled every shelf in my living room. For most of my life, I believed kindness could outlast pride, patience could outlast anger, and family could survive almost anything. I was wrong. Looking back now, I can see that losing my house wasn't the real tragedy. The real tragedy was realizing I had ignored dozens of warning signs because I wanted to believe love was stronger than selfishness. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 70 years old, a retired elementary school librarian from Columbus, Ohio. I spent 38 years helping children discover stories that taught honesty, compassion, and courage. I honestly believed those same values had taken root inside my own family. My husband, Richard, and I built our 2-story brick home almost 40 years ago. Every room carried memories that could never be replaced. We painted the nursery ourselves before our son Daniel was born. We planted 2 maple trees in the front yard the spring after our 10th anniversary. We celebrated birthdays, graduations, Thanksgiving dinners, and quiet Sunday afternoons around the same oak dining table, Richard insisted would last forever. After Richard passed away from heart failure 3 years ago, the house became both my comfort and my burden. Every hallway reminded me of the man who used to whistle while fixing loose cabinet doors or trimming the hedges before the neighbors woke up. Living there alone was difficult, but leaving never crossed my mind. It wasn't simply a house. It was the last place where I could still hear echoes of the life we had built together. Daniel visited less often after he married Lauren. First, I blamed busy schedules. Careers were demanding. Traffic across town was frustrating. Young couples needed privacy. Every excuse sounded reasonable because I wanted it to. Lauren always smiled politely when she saw me, but there was something careful about her kindness. It felt measured, as though every compliment had been rehearsed before it reached her lips. She insisted on organizing family dinners, handling financial conversations, even answering questions that were directed at Daniel. I noticed it, but I convinced myself that every family changes after marriage. Love requires adjustment, I reminded myself. I had repeated those words so many times that I almost believed them. I never imagined those quiet adjustments were slowly becoming the foundation of the day. I would stand on my own front porch, holding a useless key, wondering how a stranger could be locked out of the home she had spent a lifetime creating. I spent the next several days paying closer attention than I ever had before. Once I stopped making excuses for everyone else, small details began connecting like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across my life for years. Daniel no longer asked my opinion before making family decisions. Instead, he would glance toward Lauren, waiting almost unconsciously for her reaction before answering even the simplest question. If I suggested having Sunday dinner at my house, Lauren would politely explain that they already had plans. If I offered to help with a holiday meal, she would smile and say everything had already been taken care of. The words always sounded kind, but the message underneath never changed. There was no longer a place for me in the life I had helped build. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel stopped by carrying a small toolbox. He told me he wanted to replace a few loose door handles and check the locks because the neighborhood had experienced several package thefts. It sounded thoughtful, and I thanked him for looking after me. While he worked around the house, Lauren wandered from room to room, opening closets, measuring windows with her phone, and quietly taking pictures. When I asked whether she was planning renovations in their own house, she laughed softly and said she simply liked decorating ideas. At the time I believed her. Now I realize she was studying every corner of my home, as though she already imagined herself living there. A week later, Lauren invited me to lunch at a small cafe downtown. She rarely asked to spend time alone with me, so I accepted immediately, hoping perhaps our relationship was finally becoming warmer. She complimented my sweater, asked about my health, and even listened patiently while I shared stories about Richard and the years we spent restoring our backyard garden together. For nearly an hour, everything felt comfortable. Then she casually asked whether I had ever considered moving into a retirement community. She spoke gently, describing beautiful apartments, friendly neighbors, organized activities, and maintenance-free living. She insisted that many older adults found more happiness after simplifying their lives. I smiled politely, but something inside me tightened. I told her I appreciated the suggestion, yet I loved my home too much to leave it. She nodded, although disappointment flashed across her face for only a second before disappearing behind another practiced smile. After lunch, I drove home feeling strangely unsettled. That evening I opened an old photo album Richard had assembled decades earlier. Every page reminded me why leaving had never been an option. There was Daniel at 5 years old building his first snowman in the front yard. There was Richard teaching him how to ride a bicycle along our quiet street. There we all were standing on the porch after repainting the shutters one unforgettable summer. Those photographs were more than memories. They were proof that an ordinary house could become the center of an entire lifetime. As I carefully returned the album to the shelf, I noticed something else. My spare key, which had always rested inside a small ceramic bowl beside the hallway table, was gone. I searched every drawer, every cabinet, and every familiar hiding place. It had simply disappeared. At first I blamed myself, assuming I had misplaced it during spring cleaning. But a quiet voice deep inside me whispered a question I was not yet ready to answer. What if it had not been lost at all? That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts drifted back to the missing key. It seemed like such a small thing, almost too insignificant to matter, yet it refused to leave my mind. Richard used to tell me that families rarely fell apart because of one dramatic event. They unraveled quietly, one overlooked detail at a time. As I lay awake listening to the grandfather clock downstairs marking each passing hour, I began wondering whether this was one of those details I had ignored for far too long. The next morning I called Daniel, trying to keep my voice light. I asked if he had happened to move the spare key while he was replacing the locks. There was a long pause before he answered. He said he did not remember seeing any extra key at all. His response sounded ordinary, but something about his hesitation felt unfamiliar. Daniel had never been a convincing liar. Even as a little boy, he would avoid eye contact whenever he tried to hide something. That same hesitation had returned. I decided not to press him further. Instead, I thanked him for his help and ended the call. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the local hardware store to have another spare key made from my remaining copy. The employee behind the counter smiled politely before examining the key. After a moment, he looked up and apologized. He explained that my lock was part of a newer security system, and that replacement keys could only be duplicated with the authorization card provided when the lock was installed. I frowned in confusion. I had never installed a new security system. My house still had the same locks Richard and I had purchased years earlier. I drove home feeling uneasy. As soon as I stepped onto my front porch, I carefully examined the front door. The brass handle looked familiar, but the deadbolt above it was different. It was newer than I remembered, almost untouched by weather. I stood there for several seconds trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. Perhaps Daniel had replaced only the upper lock while fixing the handles. Perhaps he simply forgot to mention it. Yet another excuse. Another explanation that allowed me to avoid the possibility that someone had made an important decision about my own home without even telling me. A few days later, my neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Parker, waved me over while I was watering my roses. She had lived across the street for nearly 30 years and noticed everything that happened on our block. After exchanging the usual conversation about the weather, she casually mentioned seeing Daniel and Lauren outside my house earlier that week while I had been volunteering at the church food pantry. She assumed I already knew because they had been carrying measuring tape, clipboards, and talking with two people she believed were contractors. My smile froze. I quietly asked whether she was certain it had been my house. She laughed gently and said there could be no mistake because she remembered Lauren pointing toward my upstairs windows while discussing how much natural light each bedroom received. I thanked her for telling me and wished her a pleasant afternoon, but my hands trembled as I returned to my garden. That evening I walked through every room more slowly than ever before. The dining room, the kitchen, Richard's workshop in the garage, the guest bedroom where my grandchildren slept during Christmas visits. For the first time, I was not looking at my home through my own eyes. I was trying to see it through the eyes of someone quietly planning a future that no longer included me. I wanted to believe there had to be a reasonable explanation, but doubt has a quiet way of growing once it finds a place to settle. For the next week, I stopped volunteering opinions and started listening instead. Family conversations sounded different when I was no longer trying to fill every silence. During our Sunday dinner, Lauren mentioned rising property values in our neighborhood. She spoke with surprising confidence about market trends, interest rates, and how quickly houses were selling. Daniel nodded along, adding that older homes with large lots had become especially desirable. Neither of them looked at me while discussing it. They spoke as though they were analyzing a listing they had seen online instead of the home where every Thanksgiving turkey had been carved and every Christmas morning had begun. I quietly asked why they had suddenly become so interested in real estate. Lauren smiled and said she simply enjoyed watching home renovation shows. Daniel laughed softly and changed the subject before I could ask another question. That conversation stayed with me long after they left. 2 days later, I opened my mailbox and found an envelope addressed to me from the county property office. At first I assumed it was another routine tax notice. Instead, I found a letter informing me that someone had recently requested publicly available records regarding my property. The request itself was perfectly legal, but seeing my address printed across the page made my stomach tighten. I called the office the following morning and politely asked whether they could tell me who had submitted the inquiry. The employee apologized and explained that privacy rules prevented them from identifying the individual. She reassured me that many people requested property information every day, including contractors, real estate agents, and prospective buyers. Her answer was reasonable, yet it did nothing to quiet the uneasiness growing inside me. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Richard rested beneath a simple gray granite stone surrounded by the maple trees he had always admired. I brought fresh white lilies, just as I had every month since his passing. Sitting on the small wooden bench nearby, I found myself talking to him the way I always had whenever life became too complicated. I admitted that I no longer recognized the family we had spent decades raising together. I confessed that I felt foolish for ignoring so many small warnings because I wanted peace more than truth. Richard had always believed that trust should be earned repeatedly, not given forever simply because someone shared your last name. I finally understood what he meant. As I prepared to leave, my phone rang. The screen showed the name of Richard's longtime attorney, Samuel Bennett. We had spoken only a handful of times since settling Richard's estate, so his unexpected call immediately caught my attention. His voice remained warm and professional, but there was a seriousness beneath his usual calm tone. He explained that while organizing archived client files, his office had discovered a sealed envelope Richard had specifically instructed them to deliver only if certain circumstances ever raised concerns about the family home. Samuel admitted he did not know what the envelope contained because Richard had sealed it himself years earlier. He asked whether I could stop by the office sometime that week. I thanked him, trying to keep my voice steady, but my heartbeat had already begun to quicken. After ending the call, I remained seated inside my car for several minutes, staring through the windshield without really seeing anything. For the first time since the strange events had begun, I felt something unfamiliar replacing my fear. It was not relief because I still had no answers. It was the quiet realization that Richard might have seen dangers long before I ever did, and perhaps he had left behind exactly what I would need before this story was over. I arrived at Samuel Bennett's office the following morning carrying nothing but my handbag and a notebook. The building had not changed in years. The same polished oak reception desk, the same framed landscape paintings, and the same quiet atmosphere that always seemed to encourage careful thinking instead of hurried decisions. Samuel greeted me with a warm handshake that carried genuine concern rather than empty sympathy. After we exchanged a few polite words, he led me into his private office and placed a large cream-colored envelope on the desk between us. Across the front, in Richard's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Margaret. Open only if you ever begin to feel like a stranger inside your own home." My throat tightened before I had even broken the seal. Richard had always been practical, but he was never dramatic. If he had written those words, he had done so for a reason. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the first page. It was not a legal document. It was a personal letter. Richard wrote that if I was reading those pages, it meant something had changed inside the family that worried him years earlier. He explained that he had noticed how easily certain conversations about money, property, and inheritance had begun replacing conversations about family and gratitude. He admitted that he hoped he had been overly cautious, but he wanted to make certain I would never be left without knowledge or protection if circumstances became difficult after his passing. Tears gathered in my eyes, not because I felt frightened, but because I could almost hear his calm voice speaking every sentence. Samuel quietly waited while I continued reading. The second document inside the envelope immediately caught my attention. It contained copies of several property records and legal instructions Richard had completed shortly after his first heart diagnosis. Samuel finally spoke. He explained that Richard had insisted on reviewing every ownership document connected to our home. During that process, Richard had created additional legal safeguards to prevent any transfer, refinancing, or ownership changes without my direct written approval, verified in person. Samuel looked directly at me before adding something that made the room suddenly feel much quieter. He said Richard had specifically warned him that if anyone ever attempted to pressure me into signing unfamiliar paperwork or making sudden housing decisions, he should contact me immediately before taking any action. I stared at him in disbelief. I had never known any of this existed. Samuel gave a small, understanding smile. He explained that Richard believed protecting a family sometimes meant preparing for situations he hoped would never happen. Then he reached into another folder and removed a printed document dated just 3 weeks earlier. He slid it across the desk without saying a word. It was a request for general information regarding my property file. Unlike the notice I had received from the county office, this copy contained the name of the law firm that had submitted the inquiry. Samuel pointed to the signature line. Although the request itself was routine and completely legal, the firm had listed a contact person assisting with the inquiry. The name printed there was Lauren Collins. My heart sank, yet strangely, I did not feel surprised anymore. The scattered pieces that had confused me for weeks were finally beginning to form a clear picture. I asked Samuel whether Lauren had attempted to change ownership of the house. He shook his head and assured me that no transfer had occurred, and that every safeguard Richard established remained fully active. Then he leaned forward and quietly offered one piece of advice that I would remember for the rest of my life. He said, "Margaret, do not confront people until you understand everything they believe you do not know." As I folded Richard's letter and carefully placed it back inside the envelope, I realized my role in this story had quietly changed. I was no longer searching for answers. I was preparing to learn just how far someone had been willing to go while believing I would never notice. I followed Samuel's advice with more discipline than I thought I possessed. Instead of confronting Daniel or Lauren, I returned to my ordinary routine as though nothing had changed. I attended church on Wednesday evenings, volunteered at the food pantry every Friday morning, and invited my family over for dinner the following Sunday just as I always had. If Lauren noticed that I was watching more carefully, she gave no sign of it. She greeted me with the same polished smile, complimented the roast, and asked whether I had been keeping busy. Daniel seemed relaxed, almost relieved, as though whatever uncertainty had weighed on him during the previous weeks had quietly disappeared. I realized they believed I remained exactly the same trusting woman I had always been. That assumption became my greatest advantage. Throughout dinner I listened far more than I spoke. Lauren casually mentioned that several of her friends had convinced their parents to downsize into retirement communities because maintaining large homes had become exhausting. She described cheerful clubhouses, walking trails, fitness classes, and maintenance crews that handled everything from landscaping to plumbing repairs. Every sentence sounded thoughtful, yet each one gently pushed toward the same conclusion. She wanted me to believe that leaving my home would be my own idea. Daniel finally joined the conversation, saying he often worried about me living alone. He mentioned icy sidewalks during winter storms, emergency repairs, and the possibility of falling with no one nearby. His concern sounded sincere because part of it probably was. That was what made everything so painful. Mixed within the manipulation were pieces of genuine love, making it difficult to separate one from the other. I thanked them both for caring about my well-being and quietly changed the subject. Neither of them realized I had already learned far more than they imagined. The following afternoon I drove to the public library where I had worked for nearly 4 decades. Retirement had not erased old friendships. Susan Harper, who had become the library director after I left, invited me into her office for coffee. We spent nearly an hour talking about books, grandchildren, and retirement before our conversation drifted toward family. Without revealing everything, I admitted that I had begun questioning whether people close to me were making plans without including me. Susan listened without interruption. Then she shared something unexpected. A few weeks earlier, Lauren had visited the library asking about historical property records for our neighborhood. Susan remembered the visit because Lauren had explained that she was researching older homes before making a family housing decision. At the time, Susan assumed everyone involved already knew about those plans. Hearing those words confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This was not a sudden idea. Conversations about my future had been happening in rooms where I had never been invited. As I drove home, my phone rang. Daniel asked whether he and Lauren could stop by that evening, because they wanted to discuss something important. His voice carried unusual enthusiasm, almost excitement. I calmly agreed. Before they arrived, I unlocked Richard's desk drawer and carefully placed his letter, Samuel's documents, and my handwritten notes inside a small leather portfolio. I did not intend to reveal any of it that night. I simply wanted everything close at hand. At precisely 7 o'clock, Daniel and Lauren walked through my front door carrying a glossy folder filled with colorful brochures. Lauren set them neatly across the dining room table before smiling warmly at me. The photographs showed elegant retirement communities, beautifully furnished apartments, landscaped gardens, and cheerful residents enjoying afternoon activities. She looked directly into my eyes and gently said, "Margaret, we think we have found the perfect place for your next chapter." I smiled back just as warmly, folded my hands on the table, and quietly waited for them to keep talking, because for the first time since this began, I no longer feared where the conversation was leading. Lauren opened the glossy folder with the confidence of someone presenting wonderful news, rather than asking another person to leave the home she loved. She carefully arranged brochures across my dining room table, pointing out photographs of elegant apartments, flower gardens, walking paths, and smiling residents gathered around fireplaces and card tables. Every image had been selected to make the decision appear obvious. She explained that the community offered transportation, housekeeping, fitness classes, and medical staff available around the clock. Daniel occasionally added comments about safety, convenience, and how much less I would have to worry about maintaining such a large property. I listened without interrupting. Years earlier, I would have filled every silence with reassurance, trying to make everyone comfortable. This time I allowed the quiet to remain exactly where it belonged. Eventually, Lauren slid a neatly prepared folder toward me. Inside were floor plans, pricing information, and a checklist outlining the moving process. Tucked behind those pages was another document that immediately caught my attention. It was not a contract, but a preliminary authorization allowing representatives from the retirement community to begin coordinating relocation services. Near the bottom was a blank signature line with my name already printed beneath it. Lauren smiled warmly and explained that signing it would not obligate me to move immediately. According to her, it would simply allow them to reserve my preferred apartment before someone else claimed it. Daniel nodded in agreement, adding that opportunities like this disappeared quickly. I slowly closed the folder and folded my hands together. Then I asked the simplest question I could think of. I asked when they had started planning all of this. Neither of them answered immediately. Lauren finally admitted they had been researching retirement communities for several months, because they believed it was important to prepare before an emergency forced everyone into rushed decisions. Daniel added that they only wanted what was best for me. I believed he meant those words. Yet I also noticed something else. Neither of them had ever asked what I wanted. They had spent months discussing my future without once inviting me into the conversation. I thanked them for all the effort they had invested before gently asking another question. I wanted to know who had recommended this particular community. Lauren explained that a real estate consultant had mentioned it while discussing housing options for older homeowners. The phrase settled heavily in the room. Housing options. Not family conversations. Not shared decisions. Housing options. I smiled politely and asked whether that same consultant had also recommended measuring every room inside my house while I was away. Lauren's expression changed so quickly that even Daniel noticed. She looked toward him before answering that they had only been estimating how much furniture would fit into a smaller apartment if I ever decided to move. Her explanation sounded smooth, but the hesitation before it spoke much louder than her words. Daniel turned toward her with a puzzled expression, clearly hearing that detail for the first time. Before either of them could continue, I stood and carried the coffee cups into the kitchen. I needed only a few seconds alone to steady my thoughts. Looking out the window above the sink, I saw Richard's maple trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. For the first time in weeks, I no longer felt trapped by uncertainty. I returned to the dining room carrying fresh coffee and quietly placed the cups in front of them. Then I looked at the unsigned authorization form one final time before sliding it back across the table. I thanked them sincerely for their concern, but I explained that I never signed important documents without allowing my attorney to review them first. Lauren's smile remained in place, although it no longer reached her eyes. Daniel seemed surprised by my response, perhaps because I had never spoken that way before. Lauren carefully gathered every brochure and every document back into the folder, saying there was no rush and that they could discuss everything again soon. I nodded pleasantly, walked them to the front door, and wished them a safe drive home. After their car disappeared down the street, I locked the door, returned to Richard's old desk, opened the leather portfolio, and quietly added one more page to the growing record of everything that had happened. The game they believed they were carefully controlling had just changed. And they still had no idea that every move was leading exactly where Richard had prepared me to go. The following morning I met Samuel Bennett once again, this time carrying the leather portfolio that had slowly become a record of everything I had witnessed. I showed him the retirement community brochures, the unsigned authorization form, and the notes I had written after every conversation with Daniel and Lauren. He read each page carefully without interrupting. When he finished, he folded his hands and looked at me with the same calm expression Richard had always respected. He explained that none of the individual actions I described were illegal by themselves. Families often discussed future living arrangements, researched housing options, and gathered information. What concerned him was the pattern. Every important decision seemed to be moving in one direction without my knowledge or participation. Samuel suggested that I remain patient a little longer because people who believed their plans were succeeding often revealed much more than they intended. Before I left, he handed me copies of every legal document protecting my ownership of the house. He encouraged me to keep them somewhere safe, and never allow anyone to pressure me into signing paperwork without independent legal advice. I thanked him and drove home feeling something I had not experienced in weeks. I felt prepared. 2 days later, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded cheerful as he invited me to dinner at his house the following Saturday. He explained that Lauren wanted to cook my favorite meal and spend some quality time together. I accepted immediately. The invitation itself was unusual because they rarely hosted without a special occasion. When I arrived that evening, everything appeared almost too perfect. The dining table was beautifully arranged. Soft music played in the background. Lauren welcomed me with unusual warmth, hugging me longer than she ever had before. Throughout dinner they asked about my health, my volunteer work, and whether I had given any more thought to simplifying my life. I answered politely while carefully watching the conversation unfold. After dessert, Daniel excused himself to answer a phone call, leaving Lauren and me alone at the table. She smiled gently before speaking in a quieter voice. She said she hoped I understood that every suggestion they had made came from love rather than obligation. Then she admitted that maintaining such a valuable property alone no longer made practical sense. She explained that families sometimes had to think about the future instead of holding on to the past. I calmly asked what future she meant. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. She said that one day the house would naturally become Daniel's responsibility anyway, so beginning the transition early would benefit everyone. I noticed she never said it would benefit me. When Daniel returned, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the words remained with me long after I drove home. The next afternoon my neighbor Evelyn knocked on my front door carrying a small package that had been delivered to her house by mistake. As she handed it to me, she casually mentioned seeing a real estate agent walking around my property with Daniel and Lauren earlier that morning. She assumed I had simply been away running errands because they had spent nearly half an hour examining the yard, measuring the driveway, and discussing curb appeal. I thanked her for bringing over the package, but after she left I remained standing in the hallway, quietly absorbing what I had just learned. Daniel had invited me to dinner, while someone was evaluating my property the very next day. Whether the visit had been innocent or something more, I no longer believed in coincidences. That evening I opened Richard's letter once more and reread the final paragraph. His closing sentence was simple, yet it settled my thoughts more than anything else had. He wrote that truth rarely announced itself with loud voices. More often, it revealed itself through the quiet consistency of people's choices. Sitting alone in the home we had built together, I realized I no longer needed to guess what those choices were telling me. I simply needed the patience to let the entire picture reveal itself before anyone realized I was finally seeing it clearly.